glasses high with the best of Scotch or rye. Let me hear those highball glasses clinking. Now let's drink a toast to the land we love the most and the law that started people drinking. Here's to the 18th Amendment. Long may America be.
The site of the first known brewery was found near the city of Haifa in what is now Israel. There, residue from 13,000-year-old beer was discovered at a burial site inside of a cave. Sumerian and Egyptian writing would reference medicinal uses of alcohol. And the Bible states in Proverbs 31:6-7, quote, "Give beer to one who is dying, and wine to one whose life is bitter. Let him drink so that he can forget his poverty, and remember his trouble no more." In Europe during the Middle Ages, people of all ages would drink what is called small beer. This had a lower alcohol content than modern beer, ranging between 0.5 and 2.8% alcohol by volume. But even the small amount of alcohol made it safer from diseases like cholera than many public water sources. Small beer was generally considered to be good for your health and a source of nutrients. Medieval monks were well known for making both beer and wine, and were actually allowed to drink beer while fasting. In the 1600s, English sailors were given a ration of a gallon of beer per day, while English soldiers received 2/3 of a gallon. In the 18th century, a physician by the name of Erasmus Darwin wrote a book entitled A Plan for the Conduct of Female Education in Boarding Schools, in which he said, quote, "For the drink of the more robust children, water is preferable, and for the weaker ones, small beer." But this isn't to say being drunk was socially acceptable in Christian Europe. The Bible also said, quote, "Deacons, likewise, should be worthy of respect, not hypocritical, not drinking a lot of wine, not greedy for money, holding the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience." However, at least through the beginning of the 16th century, alcohol was largely considered a gift from God by most Christian faiths. However, it was around this time that distillation technology, combined with the printing press, made higher-proof alcohol more widely available. Evidence of distillation using clay pots in India and China have been found going back to the 1st century. Wine distillation in the Islamic world was a valuable trade good widely known in the West by at least the 13th century. But access to these drinks became more difficult for Europeans with the fall of Constantinople, and even prior generally expensive luxury items rather than being widely available. Some monasteries, similar to the production of beer and wine, also had small-scale distillation operations, but these generally for medicinal rather than recreational purposes. The earliest reports of whiskey in Ireland and Scotland go back to at least 1405. It was referred to as aqua vitae, which is Latin for water of life, and a text written that year reported the death of a chieftain due to, quote, "taking a surfeit of aqua vitae." By 1495, it appears at least one monastery had the ability to produce in volume, as it was sent a message that said, quote, "To Friar John Core, by order of the king, to make aqua vitae in an amount of around 500 bottles. But it was still quite an expensive beverage, which combined with it being unaged and undiluted, limited its wider popularity and distribution at the time. In 1500, a German by the name of Hieronymus Brunschwig published a book that translated in English as Book on the Arts of Distillation out of Simple Ingredients. 16 different editions of this book were published over the next 68 years, in addition to influencing a number of other similar publications that made basic distillation commercially viable. By 1651, John French published The Art of Distillation, which took much of Brunswick's work and expanded it to industrial scale. That same year in Barbados, there were mentions of rum production on the islands, likely by slaves, who realized the molasses byproduct created from refining sugars could be fermented and distilled. An observer at the time wrote, quote, "The chief fuddling they make in the island is rum bouillon, alias kill devil, and this is made of sugar canes distilled, a hot, hellish, and terrible liquor." Even before rum became readily available, in some areas there were restrictions on alcohol in the English colonies. The first known was passed on March 26, 1636 in Maine, where the sale of, quote, "strong liquor or wine" was prohibited except for those staying in lodging or, quote, "laborers on working days for 1 hour at dinner." In 1664, the first American rum distillery was set up on Staten Island, followed by another distillery in Boston 3 years later. Rum then became one of New England's largest sources of income, at one point accounting for an estimated 80% of exports in the region, often as part of the slave trade. Scotch-Irish immigrants found that traditional grains such as barley struggled in the area of Appalachia where many of them settled, but rye brought by German immigrants thrived and could be used to make rye whiskey. Those in the South often distilled corn, which is the primary ingredient in bourbon. Apple orchards were planted arguably almost as much for hard cider as the apples themselves. When winter came, the water in the barrels of hard cider would freeze and be poured off, and when the ice was removed, what was left was far more concentrated drink known as applejack, which could have an alcohol content of between 20 and 40% ABV. Because this process really only required cold weather and container, it was relatively cheap and widely available. Prior to European arrival, alcohol had existed in more or less every area of the New World, but it was generally more akin to beer or wine in terms of alcohol by volume. But just as rum and whiskey were exports to Europe, they were also traded with native peoples. As early as 1737, a biracial man of French and Shawnee heritage named Peter Chartier sent a letter to the governor of Pennsylvania, Thomas Penn, stating, quote, "All our people being gathered together, we held a council together to leave off drinking for the space of 4 years, and we all in general agreed to it, taking into consideration the ill consequences that attend it and what disturbances it makes, and that 2 of our brothers, the Mingos, lost their lives in our towns by rum, and that we would live in peace and quietness and become another people." The proposal of stopping the rum and all strong liquors was made by the rest of the tribe in the winter, and they were all willing. As soon as it was concluded of, all the rum that was in the towns was all staved and spilled, belonging to both Indians and white people, which in quantity consisted of about 40 gallons, that was strewn into the street, and we have appointed 4 men to stave all the rum or strong liquors that is brought into the town hereafter, either by Indians or white men during the 4 years. We would be glad if our brothers would send strict orders that we might prevent the rum from coming to the hunting cabins or to the neighboring towns. We have sent wampum to the French and to the 5 Nations, to the Delaware, to tell them not to bring any rum into our towns, for we want none. So we would be glad if our brothers would inform the traders not to bring any, for if we are sorry, after they have brought it in a great way, for them to have it broke, and when they're once warned, we'll take care. The governor not only rejected this request to stop the sale of hard liquor, but demanded Chartier leave Pennsylvania, alleging he was conspiring with the French and acting against rum traders in the area by enforcing the ban. In 1756, the leader of the Catawba in North Carolina, known as King Hagler, made a similar request, writing to the Chief Justice there, quote, "I desire a stop may be put to the selling of strong liquors by the white people to my people, especially near the Indian nation. If the white people make strong drink, let them sell it to one another or drink it in their own families. This will avoid a great deal of mischief, which otherwise will happen from my people getting drunk and quarreling with white people." This message met a more receptive audience, albeit a more than a decade later. In 1767, a law was passed that said, quote, "Any trader who by himself, substitute, or servant shall carry more than 15 gallons of rum at any one time into any nation of Indians shall forfeit his bond and license." This sentiment against alcohol was shared by many leaders of various Native American groups. A Lenape prophet proclaimed in 1761, quote, "Above all, you must abstain from drinking their deadly beson, which they have forced upon us for the sake of increasing their gains and diminishing our numbers." In 1802, the chief of the Miami tribe, Little Turtle, came to Washington to give a speech before the Senate and then President Jefferson. Little Turtle was famously one of the leaders of a coalition of Native Americans who defeated the early American army at the Battle of Wabash. He said in his speech, quote, "Father, nothing can be done to advantage unless the great council of the 16 Fires, now assembled, will prohibit any person from selling spirituous liquors among their red brothers. The introduction of this poison has been prohibited in our camps, but not in our towns, where many of our hunters for this poison dispose of not only their furs, but also their blankets and guns, and return to their families destitute. Owing to the introduction of this fatal poison, we have become less numerous and happy." Following this speech, a revised Indian Non-Intervention Act of 1802 included provisions restricting the sale of alcohol to Native Americans. And while this law remained in effect until 1953, laws are just words. Enforcement was selective where it was enforced at all, meaning that alcohol sales and trade with Native communities continued, along with all of the problems the leadership noted. Among non-Native Americans, most historians point to the publication of Benjamin Rush's An Inquiry into the Effects of Ardent Spirits upon the Human Body and Mind in 1784 as a catalyst for the formation of the temperance associations. The first large-scale temperance group emerged in Connecticut in 1789 and advocated for the banning of the sale of whiskey. Similar groups emerged in Virginia in 1800, New York State in 1808, and by 1818, 8 of the 20 states at the time had some sort of temperance lottery association, all arguing against high-proof liquor. In 1825, the American Temperance Society was formed. In addition to lobbying, they would often put on stage plays, which advocated against the dangers of alcohol, some of which became incredibly popular traveling shows, the most famous of these likely being The Drunkard. The Drunkard was so popular that P.T. Barnum played it at his museum for over 100 shows in New York City. By 1835, the American Temperance Society claimed to have over 1.5 million members spread out over 8,000 local groups. While they were often interconnected with local churches, particularly among Methodists, they were also unusually diverse in terms of gender by comparison to other lobbying groups. Women's memberships in these groups was estimated between 35 and 60%. Around the same time, the Second Great Awakening was in full swing. In Connecticut, Minister Lyman Beecher wrote a series of 6 sermons on intemperance, which were widely distributed and called inebriation a, quote, national sin. Beecher was also an advocate of women's education, and while many of his children went on to achieve fame and success, the most notable was probably his daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Revivalist minister Charles Grandiston Finney traveled all across upstate New York, preaching abstinence from the so-called ardent spirits, and at some revival events, he required those attending to sign a temperance pledge. Finney and other similar revivalists traveling through upstate New York preaching temperance were also likely part of the foundation of two large major religious groups which would advocate abstinence from alcohol: the Church of Latter-day Saints and the Seventh-day Adventists. Joseph Smith's publication of the Book of Mormon occurred in upstate New York during the same time Finney and other revivalists were traveling, and his teachings included abstinence from alcohol as a revelation from God he received in 1833, leading to all of the distilleries in the Mormon settlement of Kirkland to be closed. While Smith never made it a full commandment to not drink at all, it remained a recommendation of the church. The Millerites went even further, with the founder William Miller announcing that when the second coming of Jesus came, which he initially predicted would be in 1843, that anyone who drank alcohol would be unprepared. As the church became the Seventh-day Adventists, a focus on healthy living, which included abstaining from alcohol, was part of church messaging. Over time, temperance groups began to have influence not just in public discourse, but in actual legislation. In 1851, a temperance advocate by the name of Neil Dow became mayor of Portland, Maine, and was able to pass a law banning alcohol except for, quote, medicinal, mechanical, or manufacturing purposes. This law was very unpopular with the working class, particularly a large wave of recent Irish immigrants, leading to protests on June 2, 1855, after rumors spread that Dow was hiding a large stash of alcohol in the city vaults. A supply of alcohol was kept there, but it was allowed by law for the dispersion for the medicinal and mechanical physicians, at least according to Dow. A crowd that was estimated between 1,000 and 3,000 people appeared, in a city that only had 21,000 people total. They began throwing rocks and becoming unruly. When police were unable to disperse the crowd, Dow called in the militia, which fired into the crowd on his orders. At least one man was killed and 7 others wounded, and the law was repealed the following year. In spite of this, so-called Maine Laws passed in 13 states and territories throughout the 1850s. But the Civil War stopped the momentum and led to most being repealed due to the need for sources of income from taxation. But once the war was over, the movement returned. In July of 1868, a national temperance convention was held in Cleveland, and delegates passed a resolution to shift from focusing on lobbying for changes in law to actively running candidates for political office. In 1869, the Prohibition Party was founded. In 1872, they ran on a platform which, in addition to supporting alcoholic prohibition, also advocated for the direct election of senators, lowering tariffs, and universal suffrage for both men and women of all races, as well as increased immigration. But their candidate not only received no electoral college votes, but only 5,607 of the nearly 6.5 million votes cast were cast for them. In 1876, they changed the name to the National Prohibition Reform Party. However, the results were largely the same, getting only 6,945 votes nationally. Alongside the new political party, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed in 1873 around the stated purpose of, quote, creating a sober and pure world. While this group emerged from alcoholic prohibition movements generally, they also focused on wider issues related to abstinence, purity, and evangelical Christianity. The first president was Annie Turner Wittenmeyer, who served from 1874 to 1879. But her personal opposition to women's suffrage, which she believed would reduce women's moral authority because of the corruption of politics, led to her being replaced in 1879 by Frances Willard. On becoming president, Willard stated the goal of the organization was to become a, quote, union of women from all denominations for the purpose of educating the young, forming a better public sentiment, reforming the drinking classes, transforming by the power of divine grace those who were enslaved by alcohol, and removing the dram shop from our streets by law. She blended arguments for prohibition and women's suffrage together around the idea she described as home protection. She argued, quote, the movement, the object of which is to secure for all women above the age of 21 years the ballot as one means of protection of their homes from the devastation caused by legalized traffic in strong drink. This was seen by many as a more moderate argument for women's suffrage, as it was seen in more in line with traditional gender roles than other suffragettes. She cited scripture to argue, quote, God sets male and female side by side throughout his realm of law. In addition to laws around alcohol, they advocated for abstinence, raising the age of consent, and labor rights for both men and women. The group grew rapidly, even internationally, but it was local chapters where most decisions were still made, as they were able to act with autonomy around local issues rather than waiting for national change to come. For example, in 1881, temperance lawmakers in Kansas added a prohibition of alcohol to the Constitution, but its enforcement was selective and lax. An activist by the name of Carrie Nation was arrested over 30 times for going into saloons to attempt to enforce the law as a private citizen. At times, she would enter with an axe she used to break liquor bottles. Most protests were less destructive, often involving groups of women singing and praying in saloons to deter customers from entering. As other states also began to add prohibition laws and amendments, challenges to the laws began to appear before the Supreme Court. Kansas's law went to the Supreme Court under Mugler v. Kansas in 1887, affirming Kansas. Justice Harlan wrote for the court, quote, we cannot shut out of view the fact, within the knowledge of all, that the public health, the public morals, and the public safety may be endangered by the general use of intoxicating drinks, nor the fact, established by statistics accessible to everyone, that the idleness, disorder, pauperism, and crime existing in the country are in some degree traceable to this evil. A second Supreme Court decision in Crowley v. Christensen further affirmed a state's right to ban alcohol, with the court writing, quote, "The statistics of every state show a greater amount of crime and misery attributable to the use of ardent spirits obtained at these retail liquor saloons than to any other source." But the continued existence of saloons in almost every urban area showed that the laws are just words without enforcement. In 1893, the Anti-Saloon League was founded under the motto, quote, "The Church in Action Against the Saloon." While initially the group was dominated by Protestant ministers, particularly Methodists and Baptists, it eventually expanded to Catholics and even Latter-day Saints, who all shared concerns over what they viewed as a corrupting influence of saloons and alcohol. All across the country, temperance groups would find local political coalitions that were able to make it a wedge issue that could bring candidates swing voters. Even in places like New York City, where prohibition overall was unpopular, support for it could be found among church groups, particularly in the black community. Aside from religious morality, some economists argue that it would increase productivity, removing so-called Blue Mondays, where hungover workers returned after a weekend of binge drinking, and they lobbied from that perspective. In the post-Reconstruction South, while much of the push was from the Southern Baptist Church, there were those who supported the temperance movement based on other motivations. Saloons tended to be places where Irish and Italian Catholic immigrants went after work, and these were also places where black entrepreneurs might be able to sell homebrewed spirits as an income source. All of this created a situation where, as one newspaper put it, quote, "In Alabama, it is hard to tell where the Anti-Saloon League ends and the Klan begins." And of course, any legislation that creates a law forbidding something people want creates an opportunity for corrupt officials to get kickbacks and bribes. Even as the laws came to the state and local areas, saloons were able to usually keep going as long as they were willing to pay the right politician or law enforcement officer. And so groups who generally disagreed on many other issues found themselves agreeing on this one issue. This created a political coalition that crossed traditional ideological and party lines. But there was one major problem that made a national law unlikely. Taxation of alcohol was a major revenue source for the federal government. However, even this barrier was lessened when in 1913 the 16th Amendment passed, allowing Congress to pass income taxes, making revenue from alcohol taxes and tariffs far less important. And while women did not yet have the right to vote nationally, most agreed it was going to be coming soon. Many states and much of Europe had already granted the right to vote to women. And many of these politicians believed women would be a huge pro-prohibition voting bloc. And the last thing to finally push it all through was World War I. One of the largest groups in America opposed to prohibition due to their cultural and financial connections to the brewing industry were German Americans. As part of the huge wave of anti-German sentiment that came from the war effort, one of the rallying points was prohibition. So when Congress convened in March of 1917, both parties had large majorities which favored prohibition. Congress passed what was supposed to be a temporary Wartime Prohibition Act in 1918, which banned alcohol with an ABV higher than 1.28%, under the argument that the grain would be used for alcohol was needed for the war effort. In December of 1917, a resolution for the National Prohibition Constitutional Amendment went through both the House and the Senate. On January 16, 1919, after 36 of the 48 states at the time ratified, it became the 18th Amendment. The amendment went into effect on January 17, 1920. When it passed, Senator Morris Shepherd said, quote, "There is as much chance of repealing the 18th Amendment as there is for a hummingbird to fly to the planet Mars with the Washington Monument tied to its tail." The amendment specifically banned, quote, "manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States, but not possession or consumption of alcohol." Many across the country didn't realize until the Volstead Act passed that the law would be applied not just to high-proof spirits like rum and whiskey, but also to lower-proof beer and wine, using the definition of intoxicating beverages as being above 0.05 ABV. Edward VIII, the Prince of Wales, reported after visiting Canada shortly before formal passage, hearing a song that went, quote, 40 and 20 Yankees feeling very dry, went across the border to get a drink of rye. When the bride was opened, the Yanks began to sing, God bless America, but God save the King. Exceptions were included in the law, allowing doctors to prescribe alcohol for medicinal purposes. As a result, doctors earned an estimated $40 million in whiskey prescriptions throughout the decade, over $500 million today. The law was always unpopular in urban areas, and attempts to prosecute were often rejected by juries. In New York, about 4,000 arrests were made trying to enforce prohibition laws, but only 6 were able to be convicted, with only 1 getting jail time. Because having and drinking alcohol wasn't illegal, there were huge opportunities for public officials to simply look the other way in exchange for payments, or for organized crime to simply take the profits from what had previously been legal business transactions. This was particularly true in cities near the Canadian border like Detroit or Chicago, where Al Capone famously built a nationally known organized crime syndicate. Estimates are that Capone's organizations reportedly earned around $60 million a year, selling liquor and running secret bars that became to be known as speakeasies or blind tigers. This was again equal to more than $500 million a year in today's dollars. Capone likely had more difficulty acquiring liquor than selling it, having to find people willing to either import or make the booze. Alcohol smugglers were known as bootleggers, named after a practice of hiding liquor in one's boot to sell illegally to Native Americans, and all of this was occurring more or less out in the open. Capone was nationally known, and the Chicago chief of police, Charles Fitzmaurice, reportedly admitted that, quote, 60% of my force were in the bootleg business. These corrupt agreements were not just in Chicago and border cities. In Omaha, political boss Tom Dennison never won political office, but had many if not most of those who did on his payroll. Rather than Prohibition having a negative influence on the saloon businesses, he was able to use it to get law enforcement to close down his competition while looking the other way at his establishments. He openly admitted to operating without a license by paying bribes to county officials for, quote, protection from the law. He said, quote, there are so many laws that people are either lawbreakers or hypocrites. For my part, I hate a damn hypocrite. And of course, it isn't actually all that difficult to make alcohol. Homemade stills weren't uncommon even prior to Prohibition. But there were even simpler solutions. The act allowed 200 gallons of, quote, non-intoxicating cider and fruit juice to be made each year at home. A company calling itself Vine Glow began to sell a grape concentrate product which included the following warning on the label. Quote, after dissolving the brick in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a jug away in the cupboard for 20 days, because then it would turn into wine. It was advertised as, quote, legal in your home, and they got a Chicago newspaper to publish a statement saying Capone had tried to push them out, but they wouldn't be intimidated. Each year, the Prohibition Amendment became less and less popular, and the Great Depression was the last straw. In rural areas, where Prohibition would have been more popular, farmers began to call for the repeal to give another option of a place to sell their grain. Politicians saw an opportunity for alcohol tax revenue, as well as creating jobs that would come from legalizing an industry, and all of this far outweighed any arguments of those who were still in support of Prohibition. John D. Rockefeller was a longtime supporter of Prohibition, but he wrote an editorial in 1932 where he said, quote, when Prohibition was introduced, I hoped that it would be widely supported by public opinion, and the day would soon come when the evil effects of alcohol would be recognized. I have slowly and reluctantly come to believe that this has not been the result. Instead, drinking has generally increased. The speakeasy has replaced the saloon. A vast army of lawbreakers has appeared. Many of our best citizens have openly ignored Prohibition. Respect for the law has been greatly lessened, and crime has increased to a level never seen before. FDR made repealing Prohibition one of his campaign promises, and even before he won in a landslide, Congress was already starting to shift toward reform of the law, if not repeal of it. But they were unable to get any significant changes passed before the change in administration. Those in favor of Prohibition came to be known as the Dries, and those who were opposed came to be known as the Wets. And with FDR's landslide, many of the Dries lost and were replaced by Wets. One of the first laws that was passed after FDR took office was a law that made beer and wine under 4% ABV by volume legal on March 22, 1933, leading Roosevelt to remark, quote, I think this would be a good time for a beer. In the brewery capital of St. Louis, it was reported that, quote, 50,000 barrels were ready for distribution the day it was signed. But some resistance continued to a full repeal of the amendment, as many in the temperance movement sought to delay in order to keep in place the bans on stronger liquor. And although there was a landslide of wet politicians and national politics, there was a fear that some of the state legislatures may still be dominated by dry politicians. To avoid this problem, the repeal bill called for state conventions to be held rather than votes by the legislature, which would ensure a more direct vote from the public, and as a result the repeal was ratified by the states on December 5, 1933, when Utah became the 36th state to ratify the 21st Amendment that repealed Prohibition. States and localities were still allowed to set laws as they saw fit, and some states did remain dry. Mississippi was the last dry state, keeping Prohibition in place until August of 1966, when 19 of its 82 counties voted to legalize alcohol. Today, 33 states allow localities to prohibit the sale of alcohol, and 9 have completely dry counties, with Arkansas having the most at 34. History is awkward.